I'm Dr. James Blackwell, Korean War historian for the 307th Bombardment Group Association. This is the 6th episode in the association's video history of the 307th in the Korean War. In part 1 of our story, we covered April through August 1951, including the major air battle over the Uiju Bridge in April. In this episode, we look at September through December, when there was an even greater air battle in October. Let's take a quick look at doctrine before we plunge into the story. Control of the air is normally one of the first priorities in a theater of war. This is especially important whenever the enemy is capable of threatening friendly ground forces from the air. Control of the air describes a level of influence in the air domain relative to that of an adversary and is typically categorized as parity, superiority, or supremacy. Here's a graphic from the Air Force doctrine on control of the air continuum. Air supremacy means the opposing force is incapable of interfering within the operational area using missile and air threats. Neither the United Nations nor the Communists obtained air supremacy in 1951. If you have air superiority, you can conduct air operations without interference from air and missile threats. United States air power had this level of control early and late in the Korean War. But from April to December 1951, neither side had control of the air. The air war was typified by fleeting, intensely contested battles at critical points during operations. This was a time of air parity. The story opens with seasoned air warfare veteran Colonel William Hanson taking command of the 307th in August. Hanson had been the wing deputy commander since May and was well aware of operations, maintenance, and morale across the wing. He had wrestled with Air Force headquarters to remove the transportation logjam that was keeping airmen in Korea for weeks beyond their posted rotation dates. The men kept going, but disappointment was beginning to grow. Hanson had spent much of World War II training and commanding Air Corps training centers in the States before commanding the 388th Bombardment Group in World War II. He would fly a total of 40 Korean War combat missions during his tenure in the 307th and was recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross for one of those missions. Colonel Hanson made a habit of presenting air medals personally, making the award a big deal with official photos and hometown news releases. Here he presents the air medal to B-29 gunner Corporal Jack Galloway in October 1951 after his 28th combat strike. The 307th would need Hanson's experienced leadership to continue its threefold mission: to interdict enemy supply, deny use of North Korean airfields to the enemy, and the rendition of close support to United Nations ground forces during a period of intense air combat. Far Eastern Air Force staff spent the summer of 1951 developing plans for an interdiction campaign to prevent the Communists from building strength for another offensive under cover of prolonged truce talks. Their calculations revealed that there were 3 sets of optimum targets: strategic, interdiction, and close support. So every night, B-29s flew close support missions supporting ground troops in contact using the highly effective MPQ-2 radar technique so dreaded by enemy troops. There were two remaining strategic targets: Pyongyang's central marshalling yard and munitions manufacturing plants, plus the far northeastern city of Rashin, the last remaining industrial facility still standing in North Korea. Both would be on the 307th's mission lineup. Just as important were 24 rail interdiction targets. While the communists were adept at employing forced labor and troops to load up the backs of their people to haul supplies to the front lines, the bulk of their requirements were brought to marshalling areas by rail. FEAF air ops planners calculated they could bring any communist offensive to a screeching halt within 90 days by concentrating on those rail centers and the choke points on the rail lines. The worst-case enemy course of action would be an all-out campaign to once and for all push United Nations forces off the Korean peninsula. Such an assault would have to be supported by Soviet and Chinese air power, with over 1,000 aircraft that had already been built up, and 100,000 more troops stood waiting in China. For such a contingency, the Joint Chiefs authorized Strategic Air Command to support General Ridgway with those atomic bombs and special B-29s that had been positioned on Guam. The potential was real enough that SAC and Far Eastern Air Forces conducted 4 secret rehearsals using conventional bombs to work out the tactics, techniques, and procedures that would be necessary to retard such a red onslaught, while UN forces regrouped and probably withdraw from the peninsula. That was known as Exercise Hudson Harbor. Face-to-face truce talks had commenced on July 8th. The Communists almost immediately proved to be intransigent at the negotiating table. Their deviousness became obvious to all within a few weeks and would be the trigger that fired off the fall 1951 Air Interdiction Campaign. The Communist delegation alleged that UN forces fired on them and bombed them in the neutral zone around Kaesong on July 16th and again on the 21st. A UN command investigation found no evidence to support these assertions. During the negotiators' lunch hour on 4 August, a fully armed company of Chinese troops marched past the UNC delegation house in clear violation of the neutrality of the conference zone. This was a double violation, in fact, for not only were there supposed to be no armed troops within a half-mile of the conference site, but also all troops within a 5-mile radius of Kaesong were to be equipped with sidearms only. By the end of August, the Communists fabricated several more incidents, and the truce talks went into hiatus. BOMCOM's air interdiction campaign went into high gear.
Films just received from Korea reveal the incident which leads General Ridgway to suspend truce talks. A column of red troops armed with mortars, rifles, pistols, and grenades is photographed by a Warner Pathé News cameraman marching through Kaesong in violation of red promises that no armed personnel would be allowed in the truce city. Spotting our cameraman, the communist troops try to hide themselves and their weapons in the bushes. But the incident is already imperishably recorded on newsreel film. The Reds' company commander, trying to scare our cameraman away, reaches for his gun, an action you will now see frozen. Our cameraman sneaks one final shot, holding his camera on his hip before leaving. Admiral Joy hurries away to report the incident, and General Ridgway orders UN negotiators not to return to the conference room until the Reds guarantee it won't happen again.
The 307th's missions in August focused on interdiction, but also included strategic targets and close support. The 14th of August was unique, with 22 aircraft and a maximum effort strike on the supply center in Pyongyang. Post-strike analysis showed that the wing's very accurate pattern was 1,750 feet wide and 5,900 feet long, eliciting accommodation from BOMCOM Commander Brigadier General Robert H. Terrell. Typhoon Marge interrupted bomber missions from the 14th to the 24th of August as Kadena hunkered down to weather the storm. The 307th struck tents, took shelter, and manned all aircraft to keep them pointed into the wind. This storm lingered for over 64 hours, and the heavy rains caused electrical problems in the aircraft. but recovery was swift, and the wing was back in action the very next night. The 307th bombed Sinanju marshalling yard and rail bridges on August 24th, visually from 21,000 feet, achieving 45% coverage of the target area. But one ship was shot down from accurate and intense anti-aircraft fire. It was hit near the initial point in the vicinity of Sinchon and left the formation heading in a southwesterly direction. Near the village of Sunan, fighter pilots reported seeing 11 parachutes emerge from the stricken aircraft and 8 men alive on the ground when they descended to cover the downed airmen. After the war, 10 of the crewmen were returned to military custody, but one man, First Lieutenant Jack L. Murray, remains unaccounted for to this day. This was the first B-29 of the 307th brought down solely by flak in the Korean War. Rashin, a North Korean town only 17 miles from the Russian-held border of Manchuria, was one of 5 North Korean industrial centers identified by SAC and the JCS as key targets for the strategic bombing campaign at the very beginning of the war in Korea. It was a critical location of naval oil storage facilities and the key railroad linking the Soviet Union with the east coast of the Korean peninsula. Worry in Washington over the probability that wayward U.S. bombs might find their way across the Soviet border, where there was a major communist airbase at Sukhaya Rechka, and political concern expressed by the State Department led the JCS to put Rashin off limits for bombing in September 1950, and as if to confirm those concerns in early October 1950, 2 U.S. F-80 jet fighters mistakenly strafed nearby Sukhaya Rechka Airfield, 100 kilometers inside the Soviet Union. Rashin lost its immunity from airstrikes on the 27th of August 1951, when 8 307th Wing B-29s conducted a BOMCOM raid on marshalling yards there. Crews observed secondary explosions and a ball of reddish-brown smoke arising from the target area after the 307th's bombs struck. Photo reconnaissance later showed this target was 95% destroyed, and this elicited a second commendation letter for the 307th in the month of August from BOMCOM's General Terrell. The 307th lost a B-29 when a close support mission on September 13th ended with an attempted emergency landing in Daegu, South Korea, in which the aircraft crashed into a mountain 5 miles out from the field. All 14 crew were killed. Toward the end of September, Air Force intelligence detected 3 new airfields under construction just northeast of Pyongyang. 1,000 manual laborers worked each site at Samcheon, Taechon, and Namsi. It was an attempt to expand the red zone of communist air power. These airfields would, in effect, have extended MiG Alley's radius beyond Pyongyang. The Soviets and Chinese intended to conduct airstrikes on American ground troops all the way south to the 38th parallel front lines. By the end of September, runways and revetments were completed, and anti-aircraft artillery guns were in place. Once fully equipped with the MiGs of the rapidly growing Chinese Air Force operating in Korea, the Communists would have a good chance of achieving air superiority. With thousands of slave laborers digging, shoveling, and packing down dirt as the underlayment for hastily poured asphalt runways, it would take repeated airstrikes to keep them out of commission. Far Eastern Air Forces developed a campaign concept for waiting until these airfields were within a few days' readiness to support jet takeoffs and landings, then launching its B-29s in simultaneous and continuing strikes at night and daylight cloud cover. The terrain did not allow for traditional B-29 radar bombing techniques, and these airfields were too distant from United Nations front lines for the MPQ-2 ground radar sites to coordinate bombing runs on these 3 critical targets. So the 3 B-29 wings turned to SHORAN bombing techniques. SHORAN, short-range navigation, had been developed in the waning months of World War II as an electronic method for bombers to navigate to their target in conditions of very limited visibility, heavy overcast, dark of night. By following radar beams, the bomber could find its way to a coordinate on the ground without ever seeing the ground with their human eyes, and far more precisely than with traditional dead reckoning or celestial methods. It basically used electronic signals instead of slide rule, lookup tables, paper and pencil to solve the trigonometry and geometry problems of aircraft navigation. For a B-29 mission, once planners designated the target, the Wing Operations Section would develop a series of instructions for the bomber crew to follow. 2 fixed location ground stations, whose precise coordinates were known by planners and crew, were designated for the bomber's SHORAN operator to home in on. The aircraft was required to approach the target along an arc formed by a fixed distance from one of the ground stations. A device in the bomber broadcast a signal to the ground stations. The ground stations each had a transponder which, on receiving the bomber's interrogation message, would then send a return signal to the aircraft. A computing device inside the aircraft's radio instantly measured the time it took for its signal to go to the ground station and return. This would enable the computer, using the constant speed of the signal, to calculate the distance of the aircraft from the ground station. And using 2 ground stations, the computing device on board the B-29 also solved the geometry problem needed to calculate the aircraft's coordinates. Some degree of error was always at work, since the aircraft had to fly an arc of constant distance from one of the 2 ground stations, and because it had to fly at a constant altitude and airspeed from the last known point. With experimentation and training, BOMCOM was able to achieve a more than satisfactory minimum measure of bomb accuracy to employ SHORAN against airfields. By the end of September, the 307th Bombardment Wing employing SHORAN routinely achieved an average accuracy of 485 feet circular error probable, better than BOMCOM's average of 600 feet for high-altitude visual bombing. On a SHORAN mission on October 13th, SHORAN operators reported that the 2 B-29s of the 307th that struck Samcham Airfield produced excellent results. Post-strike analysis showed that 24 bombs cratered the northeast end of the runway, rendering it unsuitable for MiG-15 takeoffs. And back in the States, General LeMay was training SAC's B-29 crews to employ SHORAN if the President were to direct employment of atomic bombs in the Korean conflict. In his book Black Tuesday over Namsi, Earl McGill offers a skeptical assessment of SHORAN because using it was difficult and required high proficiency from the crew. He also speculates that Soviet operators were able to fix the precise locations of the U.S. SHORAN stations and calculate for themselves the flight paths of U.S. bombers using the technique. There is no evidence in published U.S. or Soviet accounts to support that assertion. The 307's Mission 289 to bomb Namsi Airfield on October 23rd was the climatic air battle of the Korean War. Here's a British documentary presenting the view of the battle from the perspective of Russian and North Korean MiG-15 pilots.
We fought against them like sportsmen. Whoever handled their plane best won. If you are weak, bad luck. You look for a moment of hesitation. In an air battle, which lasts for, say, 20 minutes, you may only get 2 or 3 seconds. And once you notice him hesitating, that's when you press the trigger and hit the target.
The main role of the MiG-15 was to intercept American bombers, which were raiding North Korea with their Sabre escorts. The principal MiG tactic was to take advantage of its superior altitude and lie in wait at heights of up to 50,000 feet, and then ambush the American air armadas below.
If possible, go up to 50,000 feet. 50,000 feet, then American plane wouldn't come up there. You go up to 50,000 feet and look down at the American plane, go down and shoot.
In October 1951, Lev Ivanov led a Soviet MiG attack on 48 B-29 bombers.
They came flying in from the sea without cover at an angle of 30 degrees towards the bridge, which was the best approach to bomb it. The Sabres came in to protect the bombers, but they were 4 minutes late, So naturally, we took advantage of that. As soon as I saw a saber, I got onto its tail, aimed, fired, and that was that.
So many bombers were lost that this day became known as Black Tuesday. The MiGs had outmaneuvered, outflown, and outgunned their opponents. With precious few sabers available to stand up to the MiGs, it looked as though the challenge of the saber was overrated. But for the Russians, the price of keeping their activities secret would play a major role in the battle for the skies over Korea.
There are obvious errors in this 1988 BBC account in retrospect. The bombers were targeting an airfield, not a bridge. The film shows bomb groups other than the 307th, but the Soviet and North Korean pilots distinctly remember the encounter as the one Earl McGill labeled Black Tuesday over Namsi. Their personal recollections 37 years later of their individual encounters is absent any political interpretation or geographic error. There are 6 published histories which include accounts of the air battle over Namsi, and they are largely consistent with each other in describing the sequence of events, although the Russians greatly exaggerate their versions. Earl McGill was able to interview a couple dozen participants in the fight and claims that official histories are biased and inaccurate. John Brunig, who interviewed dozens of fighter pilots to write his exhaustive account of U.S. fighters in the Korean War, also covers the Battle of Namsi and interviewed some bomber crews, including a key participant that McGill was not able to access. Other than the official history by Dr. Robert Futrell, it seems none of the other accounts consulted the detailed unit histories filed by the wing and each of its squadrons each month during the war. Unit histories are publicly accessible, but for the 307th's Korean War, they run a total of about 5,000 pages. And the documents themselves are digitizations of often poorly recorded microfilm versions of decades-old manual typewriter editions with fading print on now well-worn paper. So here, unedited, is what the 307th's unit historians reported on mission number 289. October 23, 1951, will long be remembered by members of the 307th Bombardment Wing. On this day, 9 aircraft went on the target of Namsi Airfield, North Korea, and 3 were shot down within a matter of minutes. 5 more aircraft suffered extensive damage, with only 1 escaping completely undamaged. Communist air forces were briefed and ready. 100 MiGs engaged and boxed the escort of 34 Sabres, who were decisively engaged and could not reach the B-29 flight. The 307th rendezvoused with 55 Thunderjets and proceeded to Namsi. Between 0934 India and 1040 India, UN pilots observed and engaged an estimated minimum of 140 enemy MiGs. An estimated 50 MiGs intercepted the 307th bomber force of 9 aircraft shortly after rendezvous was made with a fighter escort. After several unsuccessful attempts to lure the escort away from the bombers, the MiGs attacked just after the B-29s had passed the IP. As lead Charlie flight turned on course to target, 50 MiGs circled in formation like Indians on a covered wagon train. MiGs bored in to hit lead aircraft number 151, Captain Shields, aircraft commander, Charlie flight leader. Shields dropped his bombs, then made it to the coast where the crew bailed out, but Captain Shields went down with the ship. When he dropped out of formation, all B-29s were subject to energetic and indiscriminate attacks from all clock positions. In some instances, as many as 15 to 20 MiGs worked over one bomber flight with individual 2, 3, and 4 ship elements, pressing attacks to within 50 feet of the bomber before breaking away in a climbing turn or roll. Most attacking MiGs flew normal pursuit curves, but some dived down through the bomber formation, a tactic which denied the Thunderjets or even B-29 gunners opportunity to fire. One flight of MiGs came straight up under the B-29s with all guns blazing. As Able and Baker flights turned left after bombs away, each lost a B-29 to MiGs. In addition to aircraft number 151, aircraft numbers 940 and 045 were hit badly by cannon fire from MiG-15s. When last seen, Captain Crumb's B-29, number 045, was going down through the undercast. None of his crew has been heard from. Of the crew on aircraft number 940, Captain Foltz, only one man has so far been recovered, Lieutenant Beismer, the pilot. All the men in his aircraft are believed to have effected a safe bailout. Captain Smith, Captain Goldbeck, Sergeant Cross, and Corporal Stainbrook on aircraft number 151 survived by bailing out over water and being picked up by search and rescue. The aircraft is believed to have exploded immediately after Captain Goldbeck bailed out of the plane. 3 of the remaining planes landed at Kimpo Airfield in South Korea. 1 returned to Kadena Air Base, though damaged, later the same evening. The other 2 were unflyable, and doubt existed they could ever be made flyable again. On the aircraft commanded by First Lieutenant Reeder, 6 men suffered wounds of varying degrees of seriousness, and one of these, Captain Norton G. Edwards, the navigator, died 3 days later. 3 of the aircraft in the striking force eventually returned to Kadena, with 2 of these being badly shot up. A 4th aircraft was eventually repaired and returned to service. Evidence of the stress of the battle is apparent in this posed photo of the post-mission interrogation. It was all over in less than 20 minutes. Of the 9 B-29s on the mission, 3 were shot down. 2 more were damaged beyond repair. 29 307th Bombardment Wing crewmen died. 23 were wounded and 11 were taken prisoner by the North Koreans. The Soviets initially claimed shooting down 10 of 27 B-29s over Namsi. General Lobov bragged, "Neither in that battle nor in any other did we suffer a single MiG loss from the defensive fire of the B-29s." But in fact, B-29 gunners were credited with a total of 26 MiG kills over the duration of the Korean War. 3 gunners killed 2 MiGs each. 1 MiG was even scored by a gunner in a reconnaissance RB-29. And in the midst of this vicious fight on October 23rd over Namsi, 2 307th gunners each scored a MiG kill. In this photo, 3 of the 307th's gunners posed for their reconstruction of the air battle for the post-mission intelligence section interrogation. Staff Sergeant Jerry Webb on the left holds a red model jet. Webb, the tail gunner on 151, received official credit for killing a MiG-15. On the right, Tech Sergeant Malcolm Fairchild, central fire control gunner, holds a model of a Superfort and whistles at their close call. He was initially credited with 1 destroyed and another probably damaged. In the center, Tech Sergeant Frank Beta, right gunner, lost his cap and headset when MiG shells ripped through the dome at his positions, showering him with plexiglass. Staff Sergeant Jerry Webb points to the 37mm cannon direct hit behind him that knocked out the rudder controls, while another hit damaged the hydraulic system. Further enemy contact precluded observation, but other crew members observed this MiG to disintegrate in midair before it broke away. The other officially credited MiG kill by a 307th gunner was Sergeant Fred Spivey, fighting from the lead aircraft in the mission. The interviews and personal documents collected by Earl McGill and John Bruning allow us to add some valuable detail to the unit history. Lead pilot Captain Tom Shields and his bombardier Emil Goldbeck, along with navigator Captain Ted Smith, took the BOMCOM operations order and the target folder prepared by the 307th Intelligence Section to do the mission planning on the afternoon of October 22nd at Kadena. The Shields crew was the most experienced in the entire wing, with Shields and Goldbeck having been sent directly from SAC to infuse the air effort with additional competence and experience in order to bring the new combat crews up in proficiency. Although there was a threat of enemy flak and fighter opposition, this northernmost of the new North Korean airfields under construction was just beyond the expected limit of MiG Alley. Although it was to be a formation visual mission, they developed the usual backup plan for SHORAN in case the weather took a turn for the worse. Colonel Hanson led the wing mission briefing at 1900 on the 22nd in Kadena Tent City No. 2's large meeting tent. Wake-up was set with 0100, takeoff at 4:15. The ops officer chose a classic V of V's for the 9-aircraft 3-flight operational concept. From above, in the cloudless sky, it would appear to be a tight defensive formation to any MiGs on patrol. Enemy MiG activity had grown in the first half of October, but American Saberjet pilots were proving their superior airmanship as the number of MiG kills grew steadily to 20 by the middle of October behind the control sticks of the 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing's now experienced fighter pilots. Even the venerable F-80 scored more than its fair share of big kills at this time, scoring 2 probables near Kunuri. Critics in hindsight questioned the employment of daylight formation visual bombing on October 23rd. But in fact, the B-29 SHORAN technique and its capabilities were at best adolescent in October 1951, and time was of the essence to destroy the 3 communist airfields before they could begin to initiate MiG Alley next. And in order to enable maximum coverage by the limited fuel capacity F-86 fighters based in Japan, it had to be either an early morning or late afternoon daylight strike. There were no surprises en route when they reached the turning point at Kunuri. Today the place is part of the North Korean city of Kaechon, where less than a year before Mission 289, all but one officer from the 2nd Engineer Battalion was killed or captured in the ground battles around Kunuri. More than 5,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured during the withdrawal in the face of the Communist Chinese onslaught. 3 miles north of Kunuri, North Korean slave laborers were feverishly building the new jet airfield at Samcham. The airfield was target of a B-29 mission by the 19th Bombardment Group on 18 October, and those B-29s placed 306 100-pound bombs on the runway. Communist MiGs did not show up at Samcham for the fight on October 23rd. And although Samcham never became operational during the Korean War, it is a significant North Korean Air Force base today. In something of a historical irony, today just 2 miles east of Kunuri, the North Koreans run one of their infamous internment camps for criminals and slave labor, Camp Number 1. And 15 miles to the southeast is the infamous concentration Camp 14 for enemies of the state, Christians, their families, and descendants. Fighter escort arrived on time and formed up behind and beside the 307th's formation. They reached the IP near Taechon on time at 0930. Taechon had been hit by the 19th Bomb Group the afternoon of the day before, on the 22nd. The 19th had suffered from a similar flak barrage here and were then attacked by over 40 MiG-15s. One B-29 was severely damaged but made it to the coast, where the crew bailed out over Korea Bay and all were rescued. The 307th's mission followed the 19th's so close in time, less than 6 hours, there was no opportunity to share the intel on what to expect over Taechon. Unexpectedly, intense and accurate anti-aircraft fire burst forth within the 307th's formation. Captain Shield's lead ship took hits. Worse off was Captain Reeder's Baker flight lead, but both pressed on to target. To make their bombing challenge worse, a heavy undercast at 14,000 feet now covered the ground below, and the 307th had to switch to SHORAN for the final run to target. Graphically, this is what the 307th's formation would look like from a 12 o'clock attack position. The V of V's varied the altitude of each bomber, such that an attacking Soviet pilot would have to make a snap decision as to which B-29 would offer the least chance of presenting the MiG with high risk of suffering a gauntlet of fire from the 108 mutually supporting analog computer manipulated 50 caliber machine guns in the 9 B-29s. But those odds were significantly narrowed with an onslaught of over 150 MiGs piloted by a horde of battle-hardened Soviet pilots attacking simultaneously from high, low, all 12 clock vectors, on every attack curve enabled by the superior MiG-15. A few minutes after the flak passed, the MiGs swooped in, around, and up on the B-29 formation. The first group of MiGs focused on the high cap of the F-86s, keeping the only American jets capable of handling the MiG-15 away from protecting the B-29s. The bulk of the Soviet fighters totally outclassed the escorting F-84s and were free to attack the 307th at will until they reached bingo fuel or Winchester ammo. Combat veteran MiG leaders expertly directed their flights and wingmen to individually vulnerable B-29s. The defensive formation broke apart in the face of so many swarming Soviet MiGs and their accurate 37mm and 20mm guns. The max effective range of the B-29's 50 caliber guns was 600 yards. MiGs would open fire at 1,000 yards and keep firing until they broke off, sometimes as close to their target B-29 as 50 yards. When the shooting was over, one B-29 from each squadron had been shot down, including the crews of Captains Crum, 045, Folks, 940, and Shields, 151. 29 men were killed or missing in action, including one man who died 3 days after a crash landing at Kimpo. 11 were captured, 5 of whom were returned to military custody after the ceasefire. Only one set of remains from those killed or captured on Mission 289 has been returned. Altogether, 26 men remain unaccounted for, according to the latest available DoD record. 4 men were rescued out of Korea Bay. 4 aircraft recovered at Kimpo: Reader 295, Greiner 347, Fogler 816, and Lewis 768, 2 of which would not return to flyable condition. 2 B-29s, Dempsey 824 and Field 395, made it back to Kadena after the mission. Looking retrospectively decades after this fight, American analysts have been as dismal about the October 23rd air battle as Soviets were triumphant. Earl McGill second-guesses Allied planners for their alleged apathy in not aborting the mission and rescheduling it for night or instrument conditions. Bruning states there were not enough F-86s to protect bombers from the number of MiGs available to the Communists, and that the F-84 was useless as an escort. Perhaps it was simply the case that nothing in war goes as planned. Victory is never certain, and on this day the Communists prevailed because they were better than the Americans. Since April, Bomber Command had lost 55 men to the MiG-15. Recently appointed BOMCOM Commander Brigadier General Joe Kelly convened a commanders' conference on the 24th and decided to conduct future B-29 interdiction missions only at night using SHORAN. And the 307th rose again to fight and returned to Namsi 7 more times in October and November in 1951 without losing a single aircraft. One veteran, radio operator Lonnie Atkinson from Winchester, Kentucky, recalls the November 8th mission.
Did your plane ever get into any serious trouble?
Not what I'd call serious, but November the 8th, 51, it was our turn to go to Namsi. And of course, the intelligence information he had was Namsi had the big guns and the searchlights. So we had to go to 30,000 feet in order to level off at 24,000 over the target. And just shortly before bombs away, I heard a thump. It sounded kind of close. So I climbed up in a tunnel and looked out the dome, but the plane was okay. It seemed to be okay. And But the night sky kind of reminded me of the 4th of July fireworks going off. And after we got back to base, we seen that the shell that went through the cast iron covering on the radium board engine, and I guess the thrust from the motor probably blew it out the exhaust, best we could tell.
So how did you feel when you were on these missions? Did you have a lot of stress, or were you worried, scared?
No, I guess just sort of took things as they came, I guess you'd say. At that time when we got hit, was probably the most concern I had, but we made it back okay.
Were you awarded any medals or citations?
Well, let's see, yes. Received the flying medal, I believe. I might have a picture.
I believe you have a picture there.
Yeah.
It is a rare occasion for airmen in combat to have a face-to-face encounter with the Chief of Staff in the United States Air Force. But that is what happened November 13, 1951. General Hoytest Vandenberg arrived that morning and met immediately with a group of combat crewmen of the 307th. He wanted to talk specifically to a tail gunner, and Staff Sergeant Webb was in that session. The nature of their conversation is not recorded, but immediately after Vandenberg's departure, Far Eastern Air Force's Commander General Otto Wayland demanded a full report on how many combat crew had been there longer than the 6 months tour of duty established by the Air Force. The answer was too many, the result of the shortage of air transportation. Replacements were being shipped out once a month via ocean transport. But before anyone could rotate back to the States from Korea, the replacement had to be on station and ready to fight. That took at least 45 days, and ships departed from Camp Stoneman, California, only about once every 2 weeks. The result by November was that most combat crews were still flying missions as many as 9 months after arriving in Korea. This apparently was a surprise to higher-ups, who immediately placed command attention on the matter. The bottleneck eventually cleared, but the result by early 1952 was that 60% of the combat crews in B-29 wings were fresh arrivals, minimally qualified, and with almost zero combat experience. The 307th's combat crews had mastered their SHORAN bombing skills and were damaging the airfields at Namsi, Taechan, and Samchan faster than the red laborers could repair them. Only the airfields at Uiju and Uiju remained operational by the end of November, and those two air bases on the North Korean side of the Yalu River, teeming with MiGs, were the next victims of the B-29s, and the 307th had Uiju once again in its bomb sights. The 307th had bombed Uiju in November 1950 when Soviet MiGs scored their first B-29 kill, the 371st Squadron's Tu-1814. The Communists rebuilt the base to accommodate 36 MiG-15s. On December 4th, 4 B-29s of the 307th bombed it in a nighttime SHORAN strike. The formation was attacked by both conventional and jet aircraft, but the B-29s maintained discipline and did not return fire so as not to enable enemy pilots, searchlights, or flak to pinpoint their position. Aircraft number 318 was acquired by ground searchlights and hit by enemy fighters and flak. Its upper and lower turrets, rudder, tail trim tabs, radar antennae, and auxiliary power unit were all knocked out. Captain Hawthorne, airplane commander, despite loss of practically all control of the aircraft, made a successful landing at Kimpo Airfield. The tail gunner was slightly wounded, but the 307th effectively neutralized the Uiju Airfield. Since August, the truce talks at Kaesong had bogged down in disputes about violations of the neutrality of the Kaesong site. Liaison officers between the two sides had nevertheless hammered out a proposal to change the venue to Panmunjom. By October, the senior leaders agreed, and armistice talks resumed on October 25th in tents erected the day before, adjacent to the then tiny village. The ground war was at a stalemate. Air parity prevailed in the skies above. Only an all-out military effort of the kind that the nation had put out for World War II might change the balance. The airmen of the 307th knew intuitively that the MacArthur way was not going to be the strategy going forward. No one in their heart wanted to see what a third global war in the 20th century would be like. With both sides equipped now with the atomic bomb, it would truly be a war to end all wars. Late in November, subdelegates were mapping out lines for a demilitarized zone that traced the current line of contact. Col Hanson's men saw a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. On the 18th of December, the Communists released the names of men said to be held in communist prison camps. Although the total was shamefully incomplete, the list included 25 men of the 307th. From March through December, there had even been radio broadcasts, including one 307th Airman reading a letter to home over Radio Peking. The seemingly concrete progress gave them hope that combat would soon be halted with handshakes around the table at Panmunjom. The mood at Kadena was optimistic. In December, the 307th celebrated its 300th mission in the Korean War. From April through December 1951, the 307th executed 179 combat missions. Col Hanson declared that morale in the 307th was very high as the wing opened its new permanent mess hall on Christmas Day. He made sure to recognize every deserving combat crewman was officially recognized for his achievements with the award of the Air Medal and an official photograph.
Out for volunteers in a nation being born. No sunshine patriot speeches, no summer soldier song. For the special ones who paid the price to keep the country strong. When we were needed, we were there. We were there when we were needed, we were there. No, it wasn't always easy, wasn't always fair, but when freedom called, we answered, we were there. If you want to find out who we are, just ask us where we've been. From the frozen fields of Valley Forge to a trail called Ho Chi Minh. Through the glory and the sacrifice, we do our job each day. We're citizens and soldiers, an army of